The morning Winifred Merritt rode onto Nathan Hadley's land with a branding iron resting across her saddle horn, smoke still curling from its tip. Every man on that ranch stopped what he was doing and stared like they had each individually forgotten their own names. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in the Texas Hill Country, where the cedar-choked ridges dropped down into limestone valleys and the Pedernales River ran cold and clear over smooth white rock. The sky that morning was the kind of pale, washed-out blue that only showed itself in October, when the heat of summer had finally broken, and the air carried the smell of dry grass and wood smoke, and the faint, sweet rot of fallen persimmons. It was branding day on the Hadley Ranch, which meant a long fire, a lot of bawling cattle, and the particular organized chaos that came with sorting livestock on open-range land where fences were suggestions more than certainties. Nathan Hadley was 34 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual work rather than vanity, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ears when it got long enough. He had been running the Double H Ranch alone for 2 years, ever since his father passed from a fever that took hold one winter and never let go. He was not an unhappy man, but he was a solitary one, the kind who found more comfort in the rhythm of ranch work than in conversation, who ate his supper with a book propped against the salt shaker, who knew every one of his 300 cattle by their markings, but could not always remember which of his ranch hands had a wife and which had a sweetheart waiting in town. He was crouched beside the fire pit, checking the temperature of the irons when his foreman, a heavy-set man named Cody Vance, touched his arm and said in a careful voice, "Boss, you're going to want to look up." Nathan looked up. Winifred Merritt was riding a pale gray mare, sitting her saddle the way a person sat who had been riding since before they could walk, straight-backed and easy, her dark brown hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better weather. She wore a canvas-work jacket over a plain cotton blouse, practical riding trousers tucked into worn boots, and across her saddle, resting with deliberate calm, was a branding iron. The end of it, still faintly smoking, bore the shape of a running M with a bar beneath it, the Merritt brand. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of face that would have been called handsome rather than pretty by the women in town and beautiful by anyone honest enough to say it plainly. There was nothing soft about her expression as she rode into the middle of Nathan's branding yard, past 3 wide-eyed ranch hands and a cluster of penned cattle, and stopped her mare without drama. "My cattle are mixed in here," she said, addressing the general gathering but looking at Nathan. Her voice was direct, not angry, not apologetic, simply stating a fact the way one states that it is Tuesday or that water runs downhill. Nathan straightened slowly. He held his own branding iron at his side, and he looked from the woman on the horse to the penned cattle behind him and then back again. His first instinct, the one he was not proud of, was to tell her she was mistaken. His second instinct, which served him better, was to look more carefully at what was in the pen. "Winifred Merritt," Cody said quietly beside him, as though providing a formal introduction. "Widow of Tom Merritt. Runs the Double M out past Care Creek. Good-sized operation, from what I hear." Nathan had heard of her in the vague, second-hand way you heard of anyone whose land bordered your own without the two of you having reason to meet. Tom Merritt had died 18 months prior, a thrown horse on a rocky slope, leaving behind a wife and a ranch that everyone in the county had quietly assumed would be sold within the season. It had not been sold. If anything, from what little Nathan had heard, it had grown. He set his iron on the rack beside the fire and walked toward her, wiping his hands on the rag that hung from his belt. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, and his tone was even, neither welcoming nor challenging. "That is a bold statement to ride in making." "It is a true statement," she said. She swung down from the mare with a smooth economy of motion and landed in the dust with both feet, leading the horse by the reins as she walked toward the pen. She did not wait for permission to approach. She stopped at the fence rail and pointed with one gloved finger. "That one, the brindle with the torn ear, that is mine, and the two roans standing together by the water trough, and the black heifer at the back. She is mine as well. Nathan came to stand beside her at the fence. He looked at the cattle she had indicated. The brindle with the torn ear was a distinctive animal, and now that he was looking at it properly, he could see the faint ghost of a brand on its hip that was not his own. The autumn grass had grown in around the mark, but it was there. The M-bar, clear as anything. He was quiet for a moment. The ranch hands had gathered at a respectful distance, trying to look like they were not listening and failing entirely. "She is right," he said finally. He said it to Cody, and then he turned and said it to Winifred. "They are yours." Something in her expression changed very slightly. Not softening exactly, but adjusting, the way a person who has prepared themselves for a fight adjusts when no fight comes. "I appreciate that," she said. "How did they come to be mixed in?" he asked. It was not an accusation. He genuinely wanted to understand. "The storm 3 weeks back," she said. "The one that came through from the northwest. Took out half a mile of the fence line along Care Creek. My cattle scattered and some of them drifted south onto your range. I have been riding out every few days trying to recover them. Your men must have rounded them up with your own stock." Nathan nodded slowly. It made complete sense. The storm she was describing had done significant damage to his own property as well, and in the aftermath he had sent his men out to gather whatever cattle had scattered. They would not have known her brands from his in a wide sweep. It was an honest mistake, the kind that happened on open range, and it was the reason range disputes had been a fact of life in Texas since before either of them had been born. "You said 4 head, he said. 4 head, she confirmed. He turned to Cody. "Get them separated out." Cody gave a short nod and moved toward the pen, gesturing to 2 of the hands to help him. Winifred watched this with her arms resting on the top fence rail, her hat pushed back slightly, the branding iron now held loosely at her side. Nathan noticed that she had brought it not as a threat but as evidence, as proof of her claim. It was a practical, intelligent thing to do, and he found himself respecting it more than he expected to. "You rode out here alone?" he asked. "I have 2 hands and I cannot spare them both on a recovery errand," she said. "I am perfectly capable of riding alone." "I did not say you were not." She glanced at him sideways. There was a sharpness in her gray eyes that he had not been prepared for, not hostility exactly. More like the look of a person who had been underestimated enough times that they had stopped waiting to be surprised by it. "Most men assume a woman riding alone needs explaining," she said. "Most men have not watched you handle that situation in under 3 minutes," he said. A pause. And then something that was almost briefly, a smile crossed her face before it was gone again. She turned back to watch the hands working the cattle. "You are Nathan Hadley," she said. It was not a question. "I am." "Your father was Ephraim Hadley." He was a fair man," she said. "My husband respected him." Nathan looked at the side of her face for a moment. There was something in the way she had said "my husband" that was entirely matter of fact, but carried a weight that was not. He recognized it because he had heard similar weight in his own voice when he talked about his father. The weight of a past tense applied to someone who should still be present tense. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. "I did not say so at the time, and I should have." "You were dealing with your own loss," she said. "People forget that grief does not keep to a schedule." They stood in quiet for a moment, watching Cody and the hands work the 4 cattle out of the pen. The brindle with the torn ear gave a particular amount of trouble, planting her feet and swinging her head, and one of the younger hands got a horn bruise on his forearm for his trouble. Winifred watched this with the calm assessment of someone making a mental note. "She is always difficult," she said, almost to herself. "But she throws good calves, so I keep her." Nathan turned to look at the cattle properly now, with a rancher's eye rather than a defensive one. They were good stock, healthy and well-fed, with the look of animals that had been managed with care. "Your herd looks strong," he said. "It is," she said, without false modesty. "Tom built a good foundation, and I have been building on it." "On your own?" "On my own," she confirmed, and there was something very quiet and very absolute in the way she said it. Cody returned and reported that all 4 animals had been separated and were ready to move. He handed Winifred a short rope to lead the brindle, since the mare alone would not have kept that particular animal moving in the right direction. Winifred tied the rope with a practice knot and checked it with one tug. "I thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Hadley," she said formally, gathering her reins. "Nathan," he said. She looked at him again with those sharp gray eyes. "Nathan," she repeated, as though tasting whether it fit. "Winifred." He nodded once. She swung up into her saddle, settled the brindle's rope across the saddle horn, and turned her mare toward the north. The 3 other recovered cattle followed the direction of the group with the easy compliance of animals heading home. She rode without looking back. Nathan stood and watched until she had passed through his gate and disappeared over the ridge, and he stood for a moment longer after that, aware in some distant, unexamined way that something had just happened that was more significant than the return of 4 strayed cattle. Cody appeared at his elbow. "Interesting morning," he said. "Get back to work," Nathan said, which was not a denial of anything. The branding continued through the afternoon without incident, and Nathan went through the motions of a familiar routine, but his mind kept returning to the precise, confident way she had said, "My cattle are mixed in here." The ghost of a smile she had almost given him, the weight in her voice when she spoke of Tom Merritt, and the absolute, unhesitating way she had said, "On my own." He found himself thinking about it at supper, the book propped against the salt shaker forgotten. 3 days later, he rode north toward Care Creek. He told himself it was to check his own fence line, which was true. He had been meaning to ride that section since the storm and simply had not gotten to it yet. It was entirely practical. He was not looking for a particular property line or a particular woman. He found both anyway. Winifred was on foot in a dry creek bed, wrestling a fence post back into the ground with a post driver that was almost as tall as she was. She had her jacket off despite the October chill, working in her shirt sleeves, her hair coming loose from its pins in the exertion. 2 of the fence posts nearby had already been reset, and new wire had been strung and tightened with the kind of neat, confident work that showed she had done it many times before. Heard his horse and looked up, not startled, simply aware. She wiped her forehead with the back of her arm and said, "Mr. Hadley." "Nathan," he said. "Nathan," she corrected herself without apology. She looked at the post driver in her hands and then at him. "I suppose you are here about your own fence line." "I am," he said. "Yours is further along than mine, I see." "I had more motivation," she said. 4 cattle of mine drifted through it." He dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby cedar. He looked at the work she had done, the depth of the post holes, the tension of the wire. "You set these yourself." "My hands have other work," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then walked to where the next post lay in the grass. "Do you have another driver?" She regarded him with the same measuring look she had given him at the branding pen. Then she walked to her saddlebag and came back with a smaller post maul. "I do." They worked together for the better part of 2 hours, not talking much, which suited them both. The rhythm of the work was its own conversation, the mutual recognition of competence, the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood what needed doing and did it. She set the posts, and he drove them. She strung the wire, and he held the tension while she fastened the staples. When they reached the section where the 2 properties met, they stood side by side looking at where her wire ended and his began, and the gap between them that still needed closing. "My men can get to this end by Friday," he said. "I can do it tomorrow," she said, not boastfully, just factually. "Then I will not waste your time with waiting," he said. She looked at him again. It was a habit of hers. He was learning, this direct, assessing look, as though she was continuously recalibrating her expectations of him against what he actually did. He found he did not mind being measured. He suspected he was doing fairly well by whatever scale she was using. "There is coffee in my saddlebag," she said, "if you want it." The coffee was in a battered tin canteen, and it was cold and slightly bitter, but they drank it sitting on a limestone outcrop above the creek bed, looking out over the valley where both their properties spread in the mid-afternoon light. The cedar trees cast long shadows. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal with the lazy confidence of something that knew it owned the sky. "How long have you been running the Double M alone?" he asked. 18 months, she said, "since Tom died. That is a significant operation for one person. 2 hands and 1 person," she said, "but I take your meaning." She was quiet for a moment, turning the tin canteen in her hands. "People expected me to sell. I heard. People were wrong. Clearly," he said. Something in her posture changed very slightly, a fractional easing. She was not used to being agreed with, he suspected. She was used to being argued with, managed, advised, pitied, and occasionally condescended to, but not simply agreed with. "Tom left it in good order," she said. "He was a careful man. Good books, good stock records, good relationships with the neighboring ranches. I just had to continue what he built." "That is never just anything," Nathan said. "Continuing something someone else built is its own kind of hard work." She looked at him, and this time the smile was more present, still small but genuine, crinkling the corners of her gray eyes. "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat in that good quiet for a few more minutes, looking at the valley. Nathan found himself in no particular hurry to leave. This surprised him. "I should get back," she said eventually, standing and corking the canteen. "I have a count to do before dark." "I will ride with you to the ridge," he said, which was unnecessary since they were going in opposite directions from the ridge, but she did not point this out. At the ridge they stopped their horses and looked out in opposite directions over their respective valleys. The light was going golden now, long and warm, turning the limestone outcrops amber and making the cedar dark and rich. "Thank you for the fence work," she said. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. She touched her hat brim once, a small, formal gesture, and turned her mare north. He watched her go in the same way he had watched her 3 days earlier, and this time he was slightly more honest with himself about what he was doing. He was watching because he did not want to stop watching. He rode home in the early dark and told himself he would not manufacture an excuse to ride north again. He lasted 9 days before the excuse presented itself honestly, in the form of a stray yearling with the Merritt Embar brand that had somehow found its way into his north pasture through a gap in the fence that he had evidently fixed less thoroughly than she had fixed hers. He drove the yearling north himself. He could have sent a hand. He sent himself. Winifred was in her yard when he arrived, talking to a man Nathan did not recognize. A thin, weathered fellow with the look of a buyer or an attorney. The kind of man who wore a suit coat in the saddle and seemed uncomfortable doing it. Whatever the conversation was, it was not going well for one of them, and based on the set of Winifred's shoulders, Nathan had a strong feeling the one it was going poorly for was the man in the suit coat. She saw Nathan coming with the yearling and held up one finger to the man in the suit, a gesture that was politely firm in the way that meant wait and do not speak, and she came to meet Nathan at the gate. "Your yearling found my north pasture," he said, climbing down. "This one has been a trial since birth," she said, looking at the animal without particular affection. "He is a wanderer. I appreciate you bringing him. Who is your visitor?" Nathan asked, not looking at the man directly, aware that it was not quite his business. Her expression tightened very slightly. "A representative of the Consolidated Cattle Company out of Austin," she said. "They have made me an offer on the Double M twice this year. This is the 3rd attempt." Nathan was familiar with the Consolidated Cattle Company. They had been buying up properties throughout the hill country for the better part of 2 years, consolidating smaller operations into larger ones, which sounded like progress, but generally meant that the families who had built those operations found themselves dispossessed, and the land managed by men in distant offices who cared about ledger entries, and not about the particular quality of the soil or the behavior of the water table in a drought year. "They have approached me as well," he said. "And I declined." Something in her expression eased. "I am declining again today," she said, "but he is persistent. Would it be helpful to have another rancher present during the conversation?" he asked. Someone who can corroborate the quality of the range and the complications involved in the proposed purchase terms. She looked at him for a long moment with those measuring gray eyes. That would be useful, she said carefully, if you have the time. He had the time. The representative from Austin, whose name was Aldrich Fenwick, was the kind of man who smiled with all his teeth and none of his eyes, and who spoke in the language of opportunity and investment in ways that consistently seemed to leave out the part where the actual owner lost their land. He had a leather folder full of numbers that he showed with the confidence of a card player who believed no one else at the table could read. Nathan could read numbers very well. He sat beside Winifred at the small wooden table on her porch and went through Fenwick's figures with the same deliberate care that he brought to his own books, and he found two places where the buyout terms were written in such a way as to defer payments that would have meaningfully reduced the purchase price, and one clause that would have required the seller to cover certain surveying costs that should by rights have been the buyer's responsibility. He pointed these out, quietly and specifically, without drama. Fenwick's smile became fixed. "Those are standard terms in the industry," he said. "They may be standard in Austin," Nathan said. "They are not standard here." Winifred had read the same clauses herself. He could see by her expression. She had known exactly what she was refusing, but having a second voice name the specifics changed the character of the conversation, made it harder for Fenwick to dismiss her objections as sentiment or misunderstanding. It became, suddenly, simply a business disagreement between reasonable people, which was much harder to manage around than a widow who did not understand what she was signing. Fenwick left 30 minutes later, still smiling with all his teeth, promising to return with revised terms. Neither Nathan nor Winifred believed he would offer better terms. He would simply wait and try again. "You knew all of that already," Nathan said when Fenwick's horse had disappeared down the lane. "I did," she said. "Then why let me weigh in?" She was quiet for a moment, turning the leather folder he had left behind in her hands. "Because it is useful to know how you think," she said at last. He considered this. It was, he decided, a very honest answer and probably meant more than the surface of it. "And how do I think?" he asked. "Fairly," she said, "and practically. And without assuming I need protecting from information." He nodded, and she looked at him, and the afternoon light fell across the porch in long, warm lines, and neither of them moved to end the visit for some time. She brought coffee, this time hot and in proper cups, and they sat on the porch steps and talked about range management, which turned into a conversation about the water situation along Care Creek, which turned into a conversation about the drought of 1875 and how she and Tom had managed through it, which turned into a conversation about Nathan's father and the early years of the Double H, which was how they arrived, without quite intending to, at the subjects of grief and inheritance and what it meant to be the keeper of something someone else had loved. "Does it ever feel like the ranch is his and you are simply watching it?" she asked. She was speaking of her own experience, he understood, but framing it as a question so it could be mutual. "At first," he said, "the first year especially, I kept expecting to see him at the corner of my eye, kept thinking I should go ask him before making a decision and then remembering I could not." She nodded. Something in her posture was very still. "And now it feels like mine," he said, "but also still like his, both at the same time. I do not know if that resolves or if you simply make peace with it." She was quiet for a long time after that, looking out at her valley, at the double M spread below in the late light. "I think you make peace with it," she said finally. "I hope you make peace with it." He found he liked talking to her. It was as simple and as significant as that. He could not recall the last time he had talked to someone and felt understood rather than simply heard, and he drove home in the dark thinking about it and about her gray eyes and the particular quality of her silence, which was not empty but full. He began to find reasons to ride north more frequently after that. Some of them were real reasons. October on open range land was busy in legitimate ways, with the fall roundup still ongoing, and the sorting of cattle for winter pasture, and the ongoing project of fence repair that would have to be completed before the weather turned. He and Winifred had a practical interest in one another's fence lines, given the incident that had brought them together, and it made sense to ride together to check the shared boundary. Some of the reasons were less real, but she did not seem to object to them. The first time he stayed for supper, it happened by accident, or something close enough to accident that they could both pretend it was. They had been working together to sort the cattle along the boundary pasture, and the light had failed faster than expected. And she said simply that the food was already made, and it would be foolish to ride home in the dark on an empty stomach. And he agreed. And they ate beef stew at her kitchen table while her ranch hands, two steady young men named Eli and Carvel, ate at the bunkhouse table next door. Her kitchen was a practical space, clean and organized, with the kind of order that came from necessity rather than show. There were good tools hanging on proper hooks and a proper store of provisions and books on a shelf beside the fireplace that included a surveying manual, a veterinary guide, a Bible, and 3 novels that he caught the titles of and found unexpectedly interesting. He noted this. The conversation over supper moved easily, and at some point they were talking about the Consolidated Cattle Company again, and the broader pattern it was part of, the way large outside interests were moving through the hill country and buying up smaller operations, sometimes through legitimate purchase, sometimes through more questionable means. I have heard of ranches where the surveys came back wrong, Winifred said, serving him a second portion of stew without asking, which he noticed was the gesture of someone comfortable, not performance. Changed just enough to shift the property line in the buyer's favor. I have heard the same, Nathan said. There was a matter with the Holloway family over in Mason County. Lost 12 acres of winter pasture to a survey that no one could quite account for. I had Tom's surveys checked 2 months after he died, she said. I wanted them in my own hand before anything could shift. He looked at her. Smart. Necessary, she said, and it was the word she used when other people would have said cautious or careful, as though she did not see self-protection as a virtue requiring modesty, but simply as a basic reasonable practice. He helped her clear the dishes, which she did not argue about and did not thank him for effusively, simply accepted as the natural behavior of a person in someone else's kitchen, and he liked that. He had been in houses where a man helping with dishes was treated as either a heroic anomaly or a social transgression, and the simple normalcy of it here felt like a kindness. He rode home under a clear October sky full of stars, his horse moving at a comfortable walk on familiar ground, and he caught himself smiling in the dark at nothing in particular, which he recognized as being about something in particular. He was falling in love with Winifred Merritt. He turned this over in his mind with the same careful, practical honesty that he brought to everything else, and he found it was true. Not the sudden, lightning-strike version of the thing that stories described, but the slow accumulation of specific details. The way she drove a fence post with her whole body behind it, the way she used words like necessary instead of cautious, the way she had brought him into the conversation with Fenwick not because she needed protection, but because she wanted to know how his mind worked, the weight she carried when she said Tom's name, the ease of the kitchen, the books on the shelf, the second portion of stew. He was going to do something about it. But he was going to do it carefully, because she was a woman who had been managing on her own for 18 months and had every reason to be suspicious of anyone moving into the space that implied. He did not want to move into the space. He wanted to stand beside it and wait to be invited. He went about this, in the weeks that followed, by simply continuing to be himself as consistently as he could. He rode the fence line when there was fence line to ride. He stopped by the Double M when he had a legitimate reason, and sometimes when the reason was less legitimate, but at least plausible, a question about the water level in the creek, a recommendation for a blacksmith who did good work on wagon wheels, a yearling that had wandered again. Winifred's wandering yearling was making itself quietly useful. He suspected she might know this. He learned things about her in the way you learned things about a person through accumulated hours rather than direct inquiry. He learned that she rose before the sun, and that the first hour of her day was private, spent with coffee at the kitchen window before the ranch hands were up. He learned that she kept meticulous records in a set of ledger books that she updated every Sunday evening, that she had an exceptionally good eye for cattle health, that she was a better shot than most men he knew, that she had grown up in a ranch family in the hill country herself, that she had married Tom Merritt at 22 and been married to him for 7 years before the thrown horse, and that the 7 years had been, by her account, quiet and good and honest. He also learned, slowly and through observation rather than conversation, that she was lonely. Not in a way she would ever say or perhaps fully recognize, but in the way that showed in the slight lengthening of conversations that were supposed to be brief, in the way she refilled his coffee before it was empty, in the way she sometimes stood at the porch rail looking south toward his land after he had left for home, which he knew because he looked back from the ridge once and saw her standing there. She was a self-sufficient woman, but self-sufficient was not the same as not wanting company. He thought she had been alone with her own competence and her own grief for long enough, and he thought she deserved someone who saw all of her clearly and liked everything he saw. He told her this in November, when the first true cold had come, and the cedar had gone a deeper, darker green, and the mornings were sharp enough to see your breath. They had been riding the south boundary together, finishing the last of the fence repairs that the October storm had required, and the work was done, and they were sitting on the same limestone outcrop where they had shared cold coffee 6 weeks earlier, looking at the valley. A thin haze of wood smoke hung over both properties. His smoke and hers drifting together above the creek. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because you are a person who prefers plainness." She looked at him with the measuring look. "All right," she said carefully. "I have been finding reasons to ride this direction for 6 weeks," he said. "Some of them were good reasons, some of them were less good. I think you probably know this." A pause. "I have suspected it," she said. "I am not a man who does things without thinking them through," he continued. "And I have thought this through, and what I have concluded is that I would like very much to court you if you are willing to be courted. Not quickly, and not without your full understanding of what I am asking. I am asking to spend time with you honestly, with the intention of seeing whether what I believe I feel is what I believe it is." She was quiet for a long time. The hawk that had been circling the valley on the day they mended the fence appeared again, or perhaps a different hawk, circling in wide, slow arcs above the cedars. She watched it. "Tom has been dead for 18 months, she said. "I know. People in town have opinions about what is appropriate." "I know that too," he said. "I do not find that I care very much about other people's opinions on the matter, but I care very much about yours." Another long quiet. He did not try to fill it. "I have not let myself think about this kind of thing," she said at last. "I was very deliberate about that. I had too much to manage, and I did not want to cloud my judgment. And now," she turned to look at him fully, not the sideways measuring glance but direct, both eyes, nothing guarded. "And now I have been finding reasons for you to stay longer too," she said. "The coffee that was already made, the second portion of stew, I think you should know that." Something expanded quietly in his chest. "I did know," he said. "I was hoping." She gave a short, soft sound that was the closest thing to a laugh he had heard from her, and it was a good sound, genuine and warm, and it changed the whole quality of the afternoon. "We are a pair," she said, "both of us manufacturing reasons. Very practical people finding impractical excuses," he said. "Yes," she said, and this time the smile came all the way, full and unguarded, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in years. "Yes, that is exactly what we are." They did not rush anything after that. Courtship in the hill country in 1878 was not a private affair. It was a social one, observable and commented upon. And the news that Nathan Hadley was calling on Winifred Merritt spread through the community with the speed and thoroughness that characterized all news in small, interconnected places. The response was mixed, as mixed responses to things tended to be. Some found it too soon and said so. Some found it entirely appropriate and said that too. The Consolidated Cattle Company's representative, Fenwick, made one final visit to the Double M and found Nathan's horse tied at the gate, and decided the moment was not right and turned around, which was the most useful thing he had ever done. Nathan came to Sunday supper at the Double M every week through November and into December. He brought things. Once a good tool he had seen at the hardware in Fredericksburg that would make the post setting easier. Once a packet of seed that the Agricultural Society in San Antonio was recommending for winter grass cover. Once a book from his own shelf that he had thought she would appreciate. A natural history of the Texas Hill Country written by a surveyor 10 years prior, full of specific observations about water and soil and plant life. She received all of these things with the same practical gratitude, never effusive, always genuine. She came to the Double H for the first time in December, when Nathan needed an outside opinion on a young bull he was considering purchasing from a neighbor to the east, a fellow named Dressler. She examined the animal with the focused, knowledgeable eye of a person who had been assessing cattle since childhood, checked his conformation, his teeth, his feet, made Nathan walk him a short distance to check his movement, and then gave a verdict that was the same one Nathan had already privately reached, but that he had wanted confirmed by someone he trusted. "He is worth what Dressler is asking," she said. "His hip structure is better than average and his feet are clean. The calves he throws will be good. Buy him." Nathan bought him. He named the bull November, which only he and she knew the significance of. He introduced her to the Double H properly that day, showing her the barns and the pastures and the house, which was larger than her own but less full of the particular warmth that her books and her organized kitchen and her kept records gave the Double M. His house was the house of a man who had been alone for 2 years, capable but slightly hollow, and she moved through it with respectful attention, looking at things with the eye of someone assembling a picture. In the kitchen she straightened a pot hook that was slightly crooked without comment. He noticed. He was glad. On Christmas Eve there was a gathering at the church in town, the small German Heritage Lutheran church whose congregation included most of the ranching families in the area. Nathan and Winifred arrived separately, as was proper, and sat near one another, as was not subtle. The singing was good, the candlelight was warm, and when they stood for the final hymn their arms were close enough that their elbows touched, and neither of them moved away. Walking out after the service, their breath making small clouds in the cold night air, they fell naturally into step together, and when he offered his arm she took it with the simple directness that characterized everything she did, her gloved hand resting on his coat sleeve as they walked to where the horses were tied. "Happy Christmas, Nathan," she said. "Happy Christmas, Winifred," he said. They stood for a moment in the cold dark, the stars enormous and blazing overhead, the horses blowing warm breath into the night air, and he looked at her face in the starlight and thought he had never in his life felt so precisely in the right place at the right time. He kissed her for the first time that night, very gently, not presuming, just offering, and she received it the same way she received everything he offered, practically and genuinely and without pretense. "That was something I have been considering for some time," she said after. "And," he asked. "Worth considering," she said, and the warmth in her voice was the warmest thing in the cold night, and he could have stood there forever, but her mare was getting impatient, and his horse was stamping in the cold, and they were both people who took care of their animals before themselves, so they laughed a little at the practicality of it and rode home in opposite directions. January came hard, with a cold snap that drove the temperatures down far enough to freeze the surface of Care Creek and make feeding the cattle a daily battle against ice in the water troughs. Nathan rode north every few days to help when he could, and she rode south occasionally to lend her eye to his herd, which was dealing with a case of shipping fever in 3 young steers he had brought in late in the fall. It was during the shipping fever business that something changed between them in a way that was harder to describe than the practical accumulation of the weeks before. He had been up 2 nights running with the 6 steers, and on the morning of the 3rd day she arrived at the Double H unannounced, took in the situation at a glance, and sent him to sleep for 4 hours while she managed the animals. When he woke and came to the barn, she had 2 of the 3 steers significantly improved, and she was sitting on a hay bale with her jacket off and her sleeves pushed up, writing notes in the small notebook she always carried. He stood in the barn doorway looking at her for a moment before she noticed him, this woman who had simply come, who had looked at what needed doing and done it, who had not asked permission or made a production of the gesture. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, without looking up from her notes. "The middle one is going to need another day of treatment. I wrote it down." He crossed the barn and sat on the hay bale beside her, and she did not move away, and he took her hand where it rested on her knee, and she looked up from the notebook and looked at him, and what was in her eyes was not the measuring assessment of 6 weeks ago, but something entirely different. Something open and warm and a little frightened in the way that good things sometimes frightened you because you could not quite believe them. "I love you," he said. It was not planned. It was simply true, and he was a person who said true things. She was quiet for a moment, and then she turned her hand over and held his properly, fingers interlaced, with the same deliberate completeness she brought to everything. "I know," she said softly. "I have known for a while. I have been trying to work out what to do about it." "And," he said. "I love you too," she said. "That is what I have worked out." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she watched this with that open, warm look that he wanted to be the reason for forever. And outside the barn, the cold January morning went on in its business, the cattle breathing steam, the creek frozen white in the low ground, the sky a clear and brilliant blue. He asked her to marry him in February, on a Sunday morning, at the limestone outcrop above Care Creek, where they had shared cold coffee and made peace, and spoken honestly about grief and inheritance and making peace with things. He did not go down on one knee because the ground was wet from a recent rain, and she would have told him to get up before he finished speaking, and the comedy of it would have overwhelmed the moment. He asked her standing, face to face, holding both her hands. She said yes before he had quite finished the question. "I need you to understand," she said immediately after, with characteristic practicality, "that I will not be selling the Double M. The Double M stays." "I would never ask you to sell the Double M," he said. "I would like to help you run it if you will have me." She looked at him for a moment. "You would move your operation north. I am thinking we combine them," he said. "The boundary fence comes down, the cattle run together, the work gets shared. We keep both properties in both names. Nothing gets absorbed into anything else." She considered this with the focused attention she gave to real things. "That is a practical arrangement," she said finally. "It is also the arrangement that keeps you exactly who you are," he said, "which is the arrangement I want." She searched his face, and whatever she found there satisfied the last of the measuring, and she pulled him down and kissed him with a warmth and directness that he felt in his bones. They were married in April, when the bluebonnets were up along the limestone slopes and the live oaks had leafed out in that tender, bright green that they only wore for a few weeks in spring. The ceremony was at the Lutheran church, small and practical, attended by their ranch hands, a few neighboring families, and the county surveyor and his wife, who were friends of Winifred's. The wedding supper was held at the Double M, which was now also the home of Nathan Hadley, whose personal effects had been moved north in 3 wagon loads over the preceding 2 weeks. Cody Vance gave a toast that was mostly embarrassing and a little touching. Eli and Carvel, Winifred's hands, contributed a cake that Carvel had baked himself, and that was better than anyone expected. The night was warm and clear, and they sat on the porch long after the guests had gone, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her, looking at the valley that was now, properly and truly, both of theirs. "I did not expect this," she said quietly. She did not mean the evening, she meant all of it. "Neither did I," he said. "But I find I am very glad of it." "As am I," she said. The summer of 1879 was the summer they built the Double HM, which was not officially anything, but was what the ranch hands started calling it within a month of the marriage, when the combined operation began to take on a character that was neither purely the Double H nor purely the Double M, but something new that had grown from both. The fence along the boundary came down, as Nathan had proposed, and the cattle ran together on the combined range, and the spring calves were sorted and branded together at a branding that was held on Winifred's property. Nathan's fire pit moved north for the occasion. It was at this branding that Winifred, with the quiet confidence of a woman who had been managing her own operation for 2 years and was not about to stop now, brought out both irons and set them in the fire together. The M-bar and the Double H, heating side by side. Cody watched this and then looked at Nathan with an expression of a man who had learned to simply accept the reordering of all his assumptions and get on with things. Nathan caught the look and returned it with a slight smile that said, "Yes, I know, and is it not something?" They branded together that morning, Nathan taking the Double H iron and Winifred taking her M-bar, each marking their respective cattle in the combined herd with the smooth, practiced efficiency of 2 people who had been doing this their whole lives and were entirely comfortable working side by side. The ranch hands, Cody and the 2 Double H men and Eli and Carvel, found their own rhythm together with the easy competence of working people who respected each other's skill. By noon the branding was done, the cattle were settling, and the fire was banked, and they ate a meal together that Winifred had prepared that morning before the work started, cold ham and cornbread and dried apple pie and plenty of coffee. They sat in the shade of the big live oak at the corner of the yard, and there was the particular contentment that comes at the end of hard work done well. In July, Winifred told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning, the private hour before the ranch hands were up, standing at the window with her coffee as she always did. She said it simply and directly because she was Winifred, and she said everything simply and directly, and he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her carefully, as though she might object to being held carefully, which she did. "I am not breakable," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I am holding you carefully for me, not for you." She laughed, genuinely and warmly, and held him back, and they stood in the kitchen in the early morning light with the coffee going cold on the windowsill and neither of them minding at all. She was, as she had predicted, entirely not breakable. She continued to work the ranch throughout her pregnancy with appropriate modifications, and she did not tolerate being fussed over, which Nathan accepted because he had always understood that self-sufficiency was not a thing she wore but a thing she was, and loving her meant loving all of it. He found other ways to express his concern, making sure the heavy work found other hands than hers without making a point of it, riding out with her when the terrain was rough, being available in the late evening when the physical discomfort was sometimes bad, and she did not want to talk about it but wanted someone present. He was good at being present without requiring conversation. It was a skill he had developed over a solitary life, and had not expected to be useful in this particular way. The winter of 1879 arrived properly in November, cold and clear, and their son was born on the 5th of December, delivered by the midwife from Fredericksburg who had been making the journey to the hill country ranches for 20 years, and who had the calm authority of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by almost none of it. The boy was healthy and loud and had his mother's gray eyes, and Nathan held him in the first hour with the particular careful intensity of a man who had never held something so significant before, and looked at his son's face, and then at his wife's face, and felt the full, speechless weight of a life that had exceeded every expectation he had quietly carried. "Thomas," Winifred said, when he looked at her with the question in his eyes. He nodded. "Thomas Hadley." Tom Merritt's name carried forward, changed, and continued, the same way the ranch itself was changed and continued. He understood immediately and loved her for it. "Thomas Nathan Hadley," she said, to be complete about it. "Good," he said, his voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with illness. Thomas Nathan Hadley was a loud, hungry, vigorous infant who slept in short intervals and was fascinated by everything within his field of vision from approximately his second week of life, a quality that his father recognized immediately as his mother's at its most fundamental. Winifred nursed him and documented his progress in the same ledger where she kept her cattle records, which Nathan found both completely characteristic and deeply endearing. By spring, Thomas was 3 months old and doing the preliminary work of deciding whether smiling was worth the effort, a question he appeared to be resolving in the affirmative, and the ranch was moving into its second full year as a combined operation. The consolidated cattle company did not come back. Nathan had written a firm letter to their offices in Austin the previous winter, citing both his own declined offer and the suspicious survey discrepancies he had heard about in Mason County, and mentioning in passing that he had discussed the matter with several other hill country ranchers who were paying attention. He had no legal recourse, and he made no threats. He simply made clear that the operators of the Double HM were not isolated individuals to be approached separately and worn down, but were part of a larger community that was aware of what was happening and attentive to its own interests. Fenwick did not return. Perhaps he found easier ground elsewhere. Perhaps the letter had made some difference. Either way, the quiet that followed felt like something that had been earned. The following years moved the way years on a working ranch move, in the rhythm of seasons and cattle cycles, and the particular joys and difficulties that land brings to the people who tend it. There were good years and harder ones. There was a drought in 1881 that tested the combined range badly, and they managed it by making careful decisions early about which pastures to rest and which cattle to sell down, decisions made together at the kitchen table over Winifred's ledger books, and they came through it with less loss than most of their neighbors. Cody Vance took a wife in 1881, a schoolteacher named Margaret who had come to Fredericksburg from a family in San Antonio, and who turned out to like Nathan's taciturn foreman very well after initial reservations. Margaret and Winifred became genuine friends, which enriched both their lives in the particular way that good female friendship does in a place where social connection requires effort. Thomas grew into a small person of considerable determination and a great deal of his mother's directness, who had opinions about horses before he could reliably walk, and who could identify cattle breeds by the age of 4 with an accuracy that reduced the ranch hands to helpless, delighted laughter. Nathan taught him to ride on the gentlest horse on the property, a patient bay mare who tolerated Thomas's early uncertainty with the composure of a saint. Winifred began teaching him to read from the same natural history book she and Nathan had discussed in the early months of their courtship. In 1882, Winifred was expecting again. This pregnancy was different from the first, harder in the early months in ways she managed with characteristic stubbornness, and easier in the later ones in ways she acknowledged with characteristic honesty. She was 34 now, and the work of a running ranch and a 3-year-old boy and a marriage was more labor than solitude had been. But it was labor she had chosen and loved, and the difference between labor you chose and labor that simply fell on you was, as she had once told Nathan in the context of fence repair, and he had found applicable to almost everything, the difference between the same weight feeling impossible and the same weight feeling worthwhile. Their daughter arrived in August of 1882, in the full heat of a Texas summer, with the cicadas screaming in the cedars and the sky a fierce, bleached blue, and she came into the world considerably more efficiently than her brother had, as though she had considered the matter and decided to complete it promptly. Nathan had been allowed into the room for the latter portion of the labor, which the midwife regarded as unusual but accommodated, because Winifred had asked for him to be there, and what Winifred asked for, on her own property in her own delivery, was the relevant consideration. He held his daughter in the first minutes and looked at her red, furious, perfect face, and then at Winifred's exhausted, luminous one, and said, with complete sincerity, "You are extraordinary." "I am aware," said Winifred, which was neither vain nor immodest but was simply Winifred, and he loved her for it the way he loved her for all of it. They named the girl Clara, for no particularly systematic reason except that it suited her, and Clara suited it back from approximately the third day of her life, regarding the world with a calm, intent look that was not her mother's measuring assessment or her father's quiet observation, but something entirely her own. Thomas accepted his sister with the resigned pragmatism of a 4-year-old who had been told about siblings, and had decided that the information, while not particularly welcome, was probably accurate. He warmed to Clara within 2 weeks, by which point he had adopted a supervisory role in her existence that he maintained with great seriousness for the rest of his childhood. The ranch in those years took on the character that both Nathan and Winifred had built toward without quite naming it, a place that was known in the county as well-run and fair, where neighboring ranchers came for advice about cattle or water or range management, and left with straight answers rather than performances of straight answers. Nathan had never been a man who wasted words, and Winifred had always been a woman who said true things rather than comfortable ones. And together, they made a household that was trusted in the particular way that places with integrity are trusted, not because they were powerful, but because they were reliable. The surveying dispute that the Holloway family in Mason County had suffered was eventually resolved, 5 years on, through the intervention of a new county surveyor who took a thorough approach to his work, and the Holloways recovered most of the disputed acreage. Nathan had signed a letter on their behalf at the time of the dispute, one of 37 ranching families who did so, and Winifred had not only signed it but had ridden to Mason County personally to speak to the hearing. It had not changed the immediate outcome, but it had become part of the record, and records mattered to the people who had learned to keep them. The injustice of the land being stripped from smaller families, including some of the Hispanic ranching families who had been in the hill country longer than most of the Anglo settlers, and whose land grants from the Spanish and Mexican periods had been systematically challenged and sometimes simply ignored, was not something Nathan and Winifred could fix. They were aware of it. Winifred had grown up knowing families on both sides of that line, had traded cattle with them, had relied on their knowledge of the local range, and the stripping away of their land was something she spoke of with a direct, unsparing anger when she spoke of it at all. "There is very little justice in how this land was taken in the first place," she said once, on a quiet evening, not as an argument but as a statement of plain fact, one of the true things she said in the place of comfortable ones. Nathan did not contradict her. He had thought the same. They sat with that truth together, which was what honest people did with truths that could not be fixed by a fence repair or a signed letter, and they carried it without pretending it weighed less than it did. The years continued in their rhythm. Thomas turned 10 and then 12, growing long and lean and patient in the way that his father was patient, but with his mother's gray eyes and his mother's instinct for the direct question. At 11, he sat in on the fall sorting with the hands and proved more useful than hindrance, which was not guaranteed at 11, and which Cody Vance told Nathan privately represented, quote, "an unusual degree of practical good sense for a child," which from Cody was an extravagant endorsement. Clara at 8 was a different kind of creature entirely, deeply interested in everything that grew and lived, who treated the ranch as a laboratory, and had a particular fascination with the birds of the hill country that she catalogued in a small notebook she had asked for specifically, having read the bird section of the natural history book at age 6 and found it insufficient. Nathan had ordered her a better book from a bookseller in San Antonio, a proper illustrated ornithology of Texas, and her face when he gave it to her was the precise face of a person receiving exactly the thing they needed most in the world. He kept that face in his memory the way you kept the things that told you who you were. In the autumn of 1889, when Thomas was 9 and Clara was 7, Nathan and Winifred rode the full boundary of the combined property together, something they did every year in October, a tradition that had grown from the practical fence inspection of their early acquaintance into something more ceremonial, a marking of the year, a looking at what they had made together. The combined property was significant by hill country standards. The original Double H and the original Double M, now run as one operation, 380 acres of cedar and limestone and good grass, with the creek running through the middle and the ridges rising on 3 sides, and on the 4th side, the view opening out over the broader valley in a way that still, after all these years, made Nathan stop and look. They stopped at the limestone outcrop above Care Creek, as they always did. The same outcrop where they had shared cold coffee when they were still strangers being honest about it. The same outcrop where he had told her he had been manufacturing reasons to ride north. The same outcrop where he had asked her to marry him. The blue grama grass was the color of old honey in the October light. The cedar was dark and full. The creek below was running clear over white limestone, and down by the water, one of their younger steers was standing in the shallows looking at his own reflection with the mild, philosophical expression of a cow contemplating existence. "That is the one Thomas calls philosopher," Winifred said. "I know," Nathan said. "He named him at 6 weeks. It has proved appropriate." Laughed that warm, genuine laugh that had been the first thing he had fallen in love with completely, and leaned against him from the side, her shoulder to his, the way they sat when there was no urgency and all the time in the world. 11 years, she said. "Nearly," he said. "The wedding was April. We met in October. October of 78, he confirmed. You were very calm about the cattle," she said. "A lot of men would have argued. The evidence was clear," he said, "and you came with your iron." "I was prepared for a fight," she admitted. "Tom always said I was too quick to expect a fight." "Tom was probably right about some things," Nathan said. "But you were right to be prepared. In my experience, people who walk in prepared for a fight and do not get one are the best people, because it means they were willing but they were also wrong, which is a good combination in a neighbor." She looked up at him with the gray eyes that were still, after 11 years, capable of making him feel like the world had just come precisely into focus. "That is almost poetic," she said. "I have my moments," he said. She rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat looking at the valley, at their land, at the cedar and limestone, and the creek and the distant blue line of the ridge, at Philosopher standing in the water below, at the smoke rising from the ranch house where the children were with Margaret Vance, who had agreed to watch them for the afternoon with her own 2 boys. The sky was clear and enormous, the pale washed-out blue of October, the same sky that had been overhead the morning she had ridden into his branding yard with her iron across her saddle horn, and said her cattle were mixed in here, direct and matter-of-fact, and entirely prepared for a fight she did not get. "I think about that morning sometimes," he said. "The branding," she said. "Yes. What do you think about it?" He considered. "I think about the fact that if the storm had not taken your fence, none of this would have happened. Or something else would have," she said. "We bordered one another, we would have met eventually. But not like that," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "not like that." There was something she was smiling at privately, and he asked about it with a look. "I keep thinking about Cody's face when I rode in," she said. "He said your name like he was making an introduction, as though you needed one." Nathan remembered it perfectly. "I did need one," he said. "I knew the name but nothing else." "And now you know everything else," she said. "And now I know everything else," he agreed. She was quiet for another moment, the good comfortable quiet that they had built up over 11 years of practice, the the quiet that did not need filling. Below them, the steer called Philosopher waded back out of the creek and moved off toward the afternoon pasture with the unhurried dignity of a large animal with nothing pressing on its schedule. "Nathan," she said, "yes, I am glad I rode in with my iron that morning." He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and she let him, leaning into him fully in the way that still, after everything, felt like the most particular gift he had ever been given, this woman who needed nothing from anyone choosing to lean into him. "So am I," he said. "So am I." They rode home in the late afternoon light, side by side down the limestone slope, through the cedar and the golden grass, toward the double M and the double H, and the house with the books on the shelf and the kitchen where the pots hung on their hooks and the children were waiting, loud and hungry and entirely themselves. Thomas met them at the gate with news about Philosopher, who had apparently gotten out of the afternoon pasture while they were gone and been retrieved by Eli with significant difficulty. Clara met them with a new bird sighting she had recorded in her notebook, a vermilion flycatcher she had not seen before on this property, its red breast like a coal ember against the gray cedar, and she described it with the focused enthusiasm of a person who had found something that matched precisely a thing they had read. Nathan lifted Clara up so she could see into the upper pasture where Philosopher was being driven back in by a weary Eli, and she described what she saw with the same focused detail she brought to the birds, cataloging the steer's behavior and movements with an 8-year-old's earnest precision while he held her easily and watched his wife talk to Thomas about the fence gap that had let the steer out, his son's face upturned and attentive as she explained what needed doing. The sun was finishing its business behind the western ridge, and the first stars were appearing in the clear October sky, and the air smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and the cold that would come harder in the night. And Cody came out from the bunkhouse to ask about tomorrow's work, and Margaret came out to retrieve her own boys, and the evening arranged itself around all of them in the easy, particular way of a place that held people well. Nathan set Clara down, and she ran to her mother and took her hand, and Winifred looked over Clara's head at him, across the yard in the last of the light, and what was in her face in that moment was so complete and so clear that it required no translation at all. He crossed the yard to them, to his wife and his daughter and his son, to the ranch that was both of theirs and all of theirs, to the life that had begun on an October morning when a widow rode in with her iron still warm and said the words that turned out to be the beginning of everything. He took Winifred's free hand, and she held it, and they walked inside together as the stars came fully out over the Texas hill country, brilliant and countless and burning with the cold, clear fire of things that had always been there, waiting to be seen by anyone who bothered to look up. The kitchen was warm. The books were on the shelf. Supper was going to be made and eaten and the table cleared, and the children would be put to bed by two people who loved them with the settled, daily, specific love that was the most real kind. And after that the house would go quiet, and they would sit together by the fire, her with her ledger and him with his book, in the companionable, complete silence of two people who had made a life that was large enough to hold all of who they both were, and they would be. As they had been for 11 years, and as they intended to be for all the years that followed, entirely, simply, exactly themselves together. Outside, the creek ran over limestone in the dark. The cattle settled in the night pasture. The cedar stood still and dark against the stars. Philosopher, returned to his proper field, regarded the night with his customary philosophical composure, and the double HM rested under the October sky, whole and working and held with care, the way a thing is held when the people holding it know precisely what it is worth.